Okay, so let's get into what our topics are for the day. We're going to look at the key concepts of contemporary developmental attachment theory. We're going to look at how these developmental pathways lead to the various insecure strategies, and we're going to call the strategies the A, B, and C strategies, and in particular the A and the C strategies are those strategies that we might call insecure strategies, and I'll explain some of the reasons why we call them that. How the behavior of clients and service users can be best understood when we focus on the function of the behavior rather than the surface appearance or the symptom of the behavior. So a big message from this morning's presentation is about looking beyond the surface appearance and try to understand what is the function or the meaning of this person's behavior. What needs are they trying to meet is another way of putting it. How attachment theory can provide clear guidance about what constitutes psychological coherence and improvement towards better biopsychosocial functioning. So there's some really important themes and messages within attachment theory that can give us some powerful evidence about when we're getting better psychologically and when our clients are getting better in terms of their psychological, social, and biological functioning. Also the importance of reflecting on our own attachment strategies. So I've got one or two slides today which will help us to reflect on our own attachment strategies, and also how it relates to social work and safeguarding issues. And we're going to refer to the concept of the earned B practitioner, somebody who's had to really think about their lives, rethink the stories that they've told themselves about their upbringing, how they operate emotionally, how they operate in relationships, and how they're functioning and working their way towards a more integrated way of being. And then how attachment theory strongly signals the importance of relationship-based practice as being a key feature of assessment and intervention. The material that I'll be drawing on is a book that I co-wrote with Toni Morrison. I know lots of people here would have known Toni Morrison. He was a great friend and colleague. He did a lot of consulting. He lived in Rochdale, so he really knew this part of the country. And this was a book that Toni Morrison and I co-wrote over the course of about 8 years of delivering this training together. I always make a special mention of Toni because a lot of people knew him and loved him, and of course he died tragically in an accident about 5 years ago, but I always make a special mention of Toni. Just out of interest, just a show of hands here, how many of you had ever had training from Toni or knew of his work? Okay, so yeah, a number of you here. Okay. The book itself is out on display, and it's been the book that we've been using as the course textbook for the training I've been doing here in North Lincolnshire. Lovely quote from David Howe, professor of social work, who's written a lot of books on social work and attachment theory. He wrote the foreword to the book I was just showing you. If relationships are where things go wrong, then relationships are where they're going to be put right. It's a lovely quote and kind of summarizing this attachment-based approach that we're talking about. This slide summarizes what is sometimes called the biopsychosocial approach, sometimes also called interpersonal neurobiology. You can actually attend international conferences on interpersonal neurobiology now, if you can say the phrase. Essentially, this slide summarizes it. So what we have here on the left is it's a pictorial representation of the brain, the central nervous system, and how it's interconnected intimately and intricately and in endlessly complex ways with all of the organs of the body. And what this illustration shows us is that any notion that we have, and it's often described as a Western notion of a separation between brain and body, is a completely artificial notion, that the brain is part of the central nervous system and therefore intimately connected to all of the organs of the body, and the information flows in both directions. So when we use phrases like, trust your gut, what does your gut tell you? Go with your heart. I've got butterflies in my stomach. This is all very useful sources of information, and it's how our language captures how important the information from our body is. But what we're actually going to learn as I go through this presentation is that one of our attachment strategies pretty much cuts off all of the information below our chin. All of the useful source of information in our body, our feelings, our emotions, our bodily signals, is pretty much cut off in one of our attachment strategies. In another one of our attachment strategies, we're so overwhelmed by what's happening in our bodies and our emotions and our feelings that we de-emphasize the information that's available to us through cognition, through our higher functionings in the prefrontal cortex. So what happens when one system is quite integrated and it meets another system that's perhaps dysregulated? Have you ever had the experience, for example, of being in a very agitated state, very wound up about something, and you've come into the presence of somebody who has a calming influence on you? They might say to you, "Oh my goodness, you're looking very agitated today. Why don't you sit down and we'll talk about it, and I'll get you a nice cup of tea. Have a sit down." And just through the tone of voice, they bring you a cup of tea, they tell me about it, and they have a calming influence on you. Have you ever had that experience? I surely hope you have. Yes. And so what we see with an interaction like that is we see the biopsychosocial approach in action, where one very complex system is having a positive and integrating, in this instance, calming effect on the other system. And of course, this is very important in attachment theory also, because let's imagine that the system on the left is the parent, and the system on the right is a baby, newborn, just a few weeks old, who's not really able to do emotional regulation yet. They're going to really need this system on the left to be very integrated, able to attune with them, able to attune with their distress, to bring them back into a calm, relaxed state, to meet their needs. Now, this might seem a terribly obvious point I'm making, but of course, we know that the brain is often described as the most complex structure in the universe. It's one of those cliches that's often said about the brain. And so let's just think about what that means when one most complex system in the universe meets another most complex system in the universe, and they try to communicate something. Do you see all the possibilities, how that could go wrong? So isn't it kind of a miracle that we ever managed to communicate anything? Isn't it kind of a miracle that you just managed to meet somebody and talk about attunement, and you actually understood each other? That's kind of miraculous. And we know from our work in social work and my own work in psychotherapy how easy it is for this to go wrong, and what the consequences are when that goes wrong. So let's think about this model here, the biopsychosocial approach, as we go through some of the attachment theory. This triangle, I think, is a really important one to remember also. This triangle captures, this comes from some work, by the way, by Peter Senge in the field of systems and organizational analysis. And the behavior pattern function, such a crucial one for us to remember. If we're ever trying to figure out, to do an assessment, for example, to try to figure out complex behaviors that we can't really make sense of, if we're really trying to understand somebody that we're working with, we're really trying to help them to make some long-term changes, really trying to be accurate in our assessments, we need to look beneath the behavior, the problematic behavior, whatever it might be, the neglect, the abuse, the self-harming behavior, the concerning or problematic behavior of whatever type it is. If we only focus on that, we're all too likely to offer a quick fix. And what we know about quick fixes is that usually the problem recurs. Much better, if we're trying to help people make lasting changes, to understand the behavior within the context of the pattern. So examples of pattern might be, does this behavior happen when they are encountering certain kinds of stresses in their life? Does the behavior happen when they're in the presence of one parent, but not the other parent? Does the behavior happen when they're in the presence of the professionals, but not when they're with their family? Does it happen in front of the teachers, but not at home? Or at home, but not in front of the teachers? Does it happen at a certain time of the day? Does it happen at a certain time of the year? Maybe on an anniversary of a loss or a trauma of some type. So these are some examples of pattern. Does it happen around women, but not men? Or men, but not women? Does it happen in front of their siblings, but not in front of their parents? These are all examples of pattern. So once we have the behavior, and we've understood the pattern in which that behavior emerges, that's going to give us a very powerful clue about what the function or the meaning is of this behavior. And unless we do this behavior pattern function analysis, we could actually make two completely different conclusions and analyses of what somebody's behavior might be. I'll give you one example. There's a child, they've come into perhaps a classroom or a day center, or they're around a number of different adults and maybe a number of different children they haven't been around before. The child might have been diagnosed somewhere on the Asperger's spectrum, something like that. and what they're experiencing is a number of people are asking them questions, and it's agitating them a great deal. And maybe there's some other children creating a bit of chaos in the room, and they can't stand it anymore. And what the child does is they explode, they swear, and they run out of the room and slam the door. Okay, so that's the problematic behavior. Just imagine what kind of labels we might give to a child like that, etc. Now, we see the same surface appearance of the behavior, but what we see in another child is, again, an explosion. They run from the room, they slam the door. Now, if we do an analysis, not just of the behavior, which was they explode with an emotion, they swear, they run from the room, they slam the door. If you actually look at the pattern, the sequence in which that occurred, and you actually watch the child very carefully, you might have noticed that the first child was growing very agitated inside, and when they couldn't take it anymore, there was a sudden explosion and they ran from the room. And what they did when they got out of the room is they calmed down. They got back to a situation that they found tolerable. People weren't asking them questions. There wasn't all this chaos and stimulus. And what they did when they got out in the hallway is they did a little bit of rocking and they got themselves back to a calm state. What you might have noticed with the other child is what they did is they had an explosion, they swore, they ran from the room, and as they were running from the room, they were looking behind them, and the message was, chase me, chase me. Do you see? Completely opposite function. One child swore, exploded, ran from the room, and the message was, the meaning of that was, I'm very agitated inside and I need to downregulate. The other child could not bear the fact that people were not paying them attention. The fear of abandonment was driving them so much that they did the one behavior that they knew would provoke adults to chase them out into the corridor, and they would have the full attention of adults. Now, if we only focused on the surface appearance of the behavior, and we noticed a child who exploded, swore at the teachers, ran out, slammed the door, what conclusions might we draw about a child like that? What sort of labels might we give to a child like that? We might call them oppositional defiant. We might call them reactive attachment. We might call them ADHD. We might call all different kinds of things, which would take us down one route, but actually we're missing the meaning or the function of what was going on. It might have been the child's best attempt to try to downregulate, or to try to obtain a level of attention that they felt that they couldn't survive without. Two completely different conclusions that we would only get to if we tried to understand the function or the meaning rather than just the symptom. Is this making sense to you? Okay, could take us down two completely routes. The same thing with a child smiling in the presence of a parent. The smile on the surface could mean, I'm very pleased, I'm delighted to see you, I feel safe with you, I love you very much. Or it could be a smile of appeasement. I'm smiling because I know that if I don't smile, there are consequences. Or it could be a smile of, I'm smiling because I know that I need to take care of you and make you feel very good as a parent. And children can learn these strategies at a very young age. From toddlerhood onwards, they can learn these strategies. Okay, so let's bear in mind behavior, pattern, function as we go along. Here are some of our key figures. We know that, I imagine pretty much everyone here is familiar with John Bowlby's work, founder of attachment theory, particularly in the post-World War II era. Some of his foundational research with families where the children had been evacuated into the countryside during the bombings of World War II. Got him very interested in themes of attachment, separation, and loss. Mary Ainsworth was a protege of his. She was the creator of the strange situation procedure, which I have a few slides on coming up in a moment. So that was the first empirical measure of attachment. Patricia Crittenden is the main theorist I've studied with over the past 15 years. She's based in Florida, comes to the UK about 4 or 5 times a year. She's been part of that group of theorists who have made attachment theory relevant across the whole of the lifespan. Up until about 20 years ago, attachment theory pretty much stopped at age 3. And since in the past 20 years, it's been shown to be relevant across the whole of the lifespan. Crittenden has also made attachment theory relevant to social work, criminal justice, psychiatric, institutional care, etc. Because she specialized as a social worker. She was a social worker early in her career, and in a lot of her writing, she's trying to make attachment theory relevant to highly endangered and endangering families. Mary Main, again based in the States, still teaching, has made many contributions in attachment theory. If I could highlight just one, it would be to introduce the notion of discourse analysis into how we make sense of the adult attachment interview. But she's made many other contributions also. The strange situation procedure. How many of you here have ever seen, either live or on video, a strange situation procedure? Just a show of hands. Right. Okay, that looks like about half of you. It looks a little bit like this. It takes place in a experimental situation. It's a room where there's some toys and a couple of chairs. The parent comes in with the infant. It's usually done with infants about 11 to 12 months of age, although it can be done up to 3 years. And after a few minutes, a stranger comes into the room and sits down and gets involved in some mild interaction with the baby and the parent. After a few minutes, the parent leaves the room. So now the baby's alone in a room with a stranger. See how the baby reacts to that. Then the parent comes back into the room. Then after a few minutes, both adults leave the room, so the baby's now in the room on their own. And then the adults come back in. And there are various permutations that last about 20 or 25 minutes. Mary Ainsworth and her students very quickly realized that the really key moments of this procedure were the moments of separation from the parent and the moments of reunion. And as they studied the responses of the infants in this situation, they came to learn about 3 broad patterns of response in the babies, and these responses have been repeated tens of thousands of times in many different countries and cultures around the world, and they seem to be pretty robust as 3 broad patterns of response. What differs enormously is the proportions of these different types of responses in different populations. In very secure families, in low danger populations, there will be very different proportions than in a population where there's a lot of disruption, poverty, war, famine, etc. So the proportions will vary, but the 3 broad types of responses do seem consistent. And I'll take you through those in just a moment. And this talks a little bit more about the strange situation. It arose from Mary Ainsworth's work as a field anthropologist in Uganda, where she noticed that babies were very typically passed around to many different adults in the course of their care during infancy and toddlerhood. And she invented a procedure which would capture some of that same degree of stress that a baby might experience when they're being passed around from stranger to stranger. Here's Crittenden's definition of attachment. Now, she is a brilliant writer, but she packs an awful lot into a sentence. So I'm only giving you 2 of her sentences. But they're good ones, and they give us a definition of attachment. So attachment is a lifelong, so again, it's not just about babies and parents. It's about the whole of our lifespan. Interpersonal strategy, this is quite important. So our attachment strategies don't just sit within us. They sit within us in context with other people. This is a very important thing to remember. And this should remind us that we don't label people as attachment strategies. Like, oh, she's that attachment strategy. He's that attachment. That is a nonsensical thing to say about somebody unless you give it the context. Bowlby observed, for example, that babies as young as 6 months old can have multiple attachment strategies. They could have one attachment strategy in relation to mother and a completely different attachment strategy in relation to father. So which is it? We have to give it the context. Okay, so it's an interpersonal strategy. And it's a strategy to respond to threat or danger. That's when we need our attachment strategies, when we're experiencing threat or danger. And it reflects an intrapersonal strategy, so that's what's happening in our thoughts and feelings. And it's a strategy for processing information. Processing information is a fancy term for what we do with our thoughts and feelings. So attachment is a theory about danger and how we organize in the face of it. Now, Crittenden's done something very important and different with this definition, and it's rather different from a lot of earlier theorists. A lot of earlier theorists would have said that if babies, toddlers, young children, face a lot of danger early in their life, essentially their brains are going to be scrambled. Their strategies are going to be all over the shop. They're going to be a mess. And we might call that, it gets labeled various things, but we might call that disorganized. In other words, we can't make sense of it. It's all over the place. Crittenden is saying exactly the opposite. She is saying children raised in situations of great danger, they have to figure out a way of adapting to that situation, otherwise they're going to wind up dead. It's that stark. So the extraordinary variations in information processing, the extraordinary adaptations that babies, toddlers, children come up with, we can think of all as adaptations to their particular environment. And we're not going to call that a dysfunction. We're not going to call that disorganized. We're going to call that an adaptation that helped them to survive in that circumstance. So as a psychotherapist, I never use the term dysfunctional to describe a strategy. Nor do I ever think about treating an attachment strategy. That's completely anathema to my way of thinking. What I might do, though, is call a strategy maladaptive. And by calling it that, what I'm doing is I'm giving the person credit. I'm saying to the person, at an earlier time in your life, maybe before you can even remember, you needed strategies to keep you alive in the context of your caregivers, and maybe you learned to cut off your feelings, for example. Maybe you learned to really exaggerate your feelings. But those were the strategies you needed to survive, and let's give you some credit for that. The problem now is that you're still using that very narrow range of strategies when they're no longer useful to you, or where they're actually leading to you harming yourself or harming your children or getting into all kinds of trouble with the law, etc., getting you locked up. So we're going to call that a maladaptive strategy, but we're not going to call it dysfunction. This strategy is used out of context. So I hope you're getting that distinction there. In my opinion, it's a really important one. Because when we call somebody's strategies dysfunctional, we're kind of saying they are fundamentally just always wrong. And we're not giving the person credit for the fact that actually they learned to survive, and that kept them alive at an earlier point in their life. So, what are the 4 prime directives of our attachment strategies? Here they are. Faced with perceived danger, we seek safety. It's kind of logical, isn't it? Faced with perceived distress, we seek comfort. Faced with perceived isolation, we seek proximity, particularly proximity to those who can protect or comfort us. And faced with perceived chaos, which can include internal chaos, we seek predictability. Another word for predictability is what's familiar to us. And that can help us to explain why people often go back into very endangering situations. Why would she go back to that abuser? Why would that child go back to that person who was sexually abusing them? Why would they do that? Well, it might be that what they were trying to do is trying to meet some of these needs for safety, comfort, proximity, and the big one there, predictability. Because the familiar script, even though we might understand it as abusive, it might be all that person knows. And the familiarity of it might actually provide a feeling of safety in the short term, even though there are long-term very negative consequences. So, what's the real payoff of thinking about these 4 prime directives? Well, I would put it this way, and I think this is probably one of the most useful concepts I could share with you today. If you are ever puzzled by the behavior of your client, and you're kind of scratching your head and trying to puzzle through it, you're thinking to yourself, why the self-harming behavior? Why the beating of their children? Why the hitting of their partner? Why are they neglecting their children? Why are they pulling out their hair? Why the eating disorder? Why the running away? Why the drug taking? All of these kinds of behaviors that we might be puzzling through. Another way of asking that question is, when my client is doing that behavior, how are they trying to meet their needs for safety, comfort, proximity, and or predictability? It can be 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of those at the same time. The scenario I gave you earlier of the child running from the room, screaming, yelling, shouting, running out of the room, screaming. We could do an analysis of those kids. How were they trying to meet their needs for safety, comfort, proximity, and or predictability? And I think we could probably come in with analyses using all 4 of those concepts. And if you're asking the question in that way, here's what I think you're doing. I think you are... suddenly this has... If we go back to that triangle, and what I've done here is I've superimposed safety, comfort, proximity, predictability in the bottom third of the triangle. That's what I think you're doing. If you're asking the question in that way, when my client is doing that behavior, how are they trying to meet their needs for safety, comfort, proximity, predictability? This is what you're doing. You're doing a functional analysis, which is much more likely to offer you an analysis of the person's behavior that makes sense to them, and is also a way of understanding your client where you're going to be able to come up with a plan that is much more likely to help them to make long-term lasting changes. In other words, you're very likely to avoid a sticking plaster approach if you're addressing the question at that level. How are we doing so far, folks? Is this making sense? I know I'm covering material that I normally cover in about half a day, relatively quickly. I think the battery might have gone on this. I'll continue on, but you might want to change that over the break. Okay, so where do our emotional coping styles come from? And I think you'll agree with me that this little fellow looks like he would like to know. Okay, so now a little bit of self-reflection for you. This is our first introduction to the ABC spectrum. This is a very normative part of the spectrum here. I don't think you have this arrow in your slides, but that's okay. It's not particularly content-rich, as you can see. It's just an arrow with A, B, and C under it. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to point to the screen according to your self-reflection on how you tend to be, but you, and the hypothetical I'm going to ask you to consider here is you, but on a really bad day. You on a really, really bad day when nothing is going your way. The sort of day where you wake up late because the alarm clock failed, you're staggering around in the semi-darkness trying to get your clothes on and you stub your toe, so now you're in physical pain. You manage to struggle into your clothes and you spill tea or coffee down the front of your clothes, so now you got to get changed into the clothes that you hadn't ironed. You stagger out into the street and a car splashes you with a huge puddle of water. Now you're completely soaked. You stagger into the office 20 minutes late. Somebody screams at you for missing the key meeting. Then you make the mistake of opening up your emails, and guess what? An irate, complaining email, and then you get a phone call from the person who sent that email who wants to make their point extra clear. Now, let's imagine where you might be on this emotional coping scale. There was a little bit of a laughter of recognition. Okay. We've all had days like that. So, now we come to the emotional coping continuum here. So if we imagine in the B position there, but what we're going to do is we're going to just move a little bit out, not fully over to the left there, but just a little bit. I'm sorry, I don't have the pointer won't work on that screen there, but just sort of halfway towards the left there. If you're there on the emotional coping continuum and I saw you around the office, I'd look at you and I wouldn't know you were having a bad day at all. I'd just see you and you'd be going about your business, you'd be typing away, doing activities. And I'd look at you and I'd think, oh, well, there you are. You're just having a normal day. In other words, you wear your emotional cards very close to your chest. Okay? You don't sort of go, letting everybody know how you're feeling inside. In fact, even if we go out to the edge here, towards the tip of the arrow, and I saw you around the office, not only would I not know you're having a bad day, but you're actually looking after me. So I say good morning to you, and you say, good morning, Clark. Can I get you a cup of tea? How are you today? How are you? How are you? Meanwhile, you're still having this absolutely disastrous day. I wouldn't have a clue. In fact, you're looking after me. Thank you very much. Okay. Now let's go to the opposite part of our arrow. So again, we move to the middle position there that says B, but now we're moving a little bit out towards the right, not fully out to the right, about halfway along towards the right. Here it's the psychological opposite. Here you're having that same bad day, and guess what? We all know about you and your bad day. The whole office knows about you and your bad day. In fact, the whole building might know about you and your bad day. Because you're screaming and you're ranting, or you're coming into someone's office using up all the Kleenex, you're banging on a table, you're having a panic attack, all the rest of this. We know you are having a bad day. Now let's move fully out to the right. We come all the way out here to the right, and not only do we all know about your bad day, but your bad day is becoming our bad day. Because we are getting sucked in to rescuing you from these dreadful things that have been happening to you. I'll come and change your car tire. I'll give you a tow. I'll give you the jump leads. I'll come and take over that case for you. I'll talk to that manager for you. I'll go on that home visit with you and give them a piece of our mind. Oh, there we go. So your bad day is becoming our bad day. Now, what are we doing in the B position? We're doing a number of different things. And again, we're talking about the different ways that people have of coping with very high emotion. In the B position, we're doing a number of different things. The first thing we're doing is we're recognizing that we're having a really bad day. We're checking in with ourselves. So, oh my goodness, I am having one heck of a bad day here. My heart is going like crazy. I've got butterflies in my stomach. My knees are wobbling. I feel like punching somebody. I feel like screaming, whatever it is. So that's the first thing we're doing. And then we're doing some thinking to ourselves, what do I need to do to help myself? Do I need to take a breath? Do I need to take a walk around the block? Do I need to do some positive self-talk? Do I need to give myself a bit of a pep talk? You can get through this. You've been through days like this before. And then I'm doing some really important extra stuff, which is asking myself, who can help me? Who is in my support network? Is it a colleague? Is it one of my teachers, one of my instructors, one of my supervisors, one of my managers? Who's in my support network that I can call upon? Okay? So, is it Harry? Yes, Harry? So maybe Harry and I have been colleagues for years and years. And you've helped me through tough times, and I've helped you through some tough times. And I say to Harry, Harry, have you got just a bit of time? I am having one heck of a bad day here. And I just need to sound off about it. You can tell me whether I'm crazy or not, and that sort of thing. And Harry says to me, sure, Clark. I've only got 20 minutes, though, because then I've got to go to a home visit. So I say, great, how about 10 minutes? And Harry says, great, okay. So even in my great distressed state, I can share with Harry what's going on with me. I can get his feedback, but now I'm not going to go on to 11 minutes, not going to go on to 12 minutes, 13 minutes, 14 minutes, because now Harry's looking at his watch and he's thinking, hang on a second, I've got to get to my home visit. So now my bad day is becoming your bad day. But I'm not going to do that. So if I'm in the B position, even though I am having this awful, awful day, I am still capable of not only getting in touch with my feelings, accessing resources around me, but I can still perspective take so that I don't intrude on you and impose on your day. And then later in the day, I might have other people that I go to. Okay, so here comes the bit where I'm going to ask you to point to the screen. Now, I won't look at where you're pointing, and you've got 3 choices of screens to point to, by the way. I won't look where you're pointing. All I will do is look that you are pointing, because I think there is an advantage in kinesthetically remembering where we actually point during this. So the question is, where are your tendencies? Okay, the answer is, of course, it depends. Okay, it depends on the situation, the day, who's around us, etc. But what I'm asking you here is, broadly speaking, where do you think your tendencies are? I'll include myself in this, because it can be useful for us to know where our tendencies are, because if we're conscious of our tendencies, we're much more likely to be able to compensate for them. So are you all ready to point to the screen? Okay. Pointy's fingers ready? And the 2 cameramen will also be pointing. Okay. Are you ready? Pointy finger ready? Okay. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead and point. And remember where you're pointing. Remember where you're pointing, because that can be useful information for you. Okay, thank you very much. Because once we're aware of what our tendencies are, we might become more sensitive to which clients we tend to click with, for example. Say, oh yeah, their attachment style is very much like mine. Or which clients we might get really enmeshed with. Or which clients we might get hooked into very unproductive encounters with. Okay? For example, if our tendencies are a little bit over in this A direction, and we perhaps have a tendency to look after others, which is quite common in the helping professions. A little bit of looking after others. How are you? Enough about me. How are you? Enough about me. How are you? Let me look after you. Let me take care of you. Okay? That's a very common tendency in the social and helping professions. That shouldn't surprise us. But what happens if we meet somebody who's a little bit over in this direction, who does helpless, helpless, save me, save me, save me, save me, and really exaggerates their helplessness? Well, that's a lovely fit, isn't it? Rescuer meets helpless. That's a lovely fit. So we need to be aware that we might have a tendency to move into rescuer mode, but that might not necessarily be the most useful thing for that person. So it's useful to know what our tendencies are. Or we might have a pattern where we don't particularly show our emotions. We don't really wear our emotions on our sleeve. And we meet somebody who's highly, highly emotive, and we problematize that. we start labeling them because it makes us uncomfortable. Or we might have unprofessional thoughts like, pull yourself together, or enough of the tiny tears routine, stop manipulating me, these kinds of things, because they make us uncomfortable. So those are some of the ways we might want to cope. In my experience also, training this model over the past 10 years, it can be just useful for us to remember in terms of our own relationships and our own families, and perhaps our own role as parents. I've found it very useful as a parent myself to think about my own tendencies. This is a simplified version of Crittenden's dynamic maturational model. It essentially extends what we were just looking at there. The arrow, the part of this model that we were just looking at with the arrow roughly equates to the normative part of the model there. Normative the qualification there is it's normative in relatively safe populations. We would not call it normative as a strategy. The B strategy would not be normative in highly endangered populations. Again, the proportions will vary as we go around the world into different settings. And there's a concerning part of the model and then endangering. By the time we get down to the endangering part of the model, these are people who have highly distorted ways of interpreting the world around them. And at the very extreme end, it's where safety becomes danger, pleasure becomes pain, truth becomes false. It's that level of distortion. And of course, we're familiar with that level of distortion if we know, and I'm sure all of you do here, know about the really powerful distortions of information that, for example, child abuse victims have to, I was going to say generate, but it might not be that they generate it. It might be a view that's imposed on them. The sort of view that says, I deserve this. This is good for me. He's doing this to me because he loves me. They're doing this to me because it's good for my sexual education. These kinds of things. Or they're doing this to me because they love me. These kinds of distortions that child abuse victims are forced to believe and buy into, that's the level there. That's the level of distortion that we get to there. Where people might later in life become a danger to themselves or others. Of course, not always. There's lots of other possibilities in terms of what happens later in life. We have to remember to see strategies as strengths. We're not going to see an attachment strategy as being good or bad in itself. And again, we have to become aware of cultural variations, huge. There are class and social variations within cultures. From an ethological or evolutionary perspective, all of the attachment styles have their place and value. And what appears to us to be a broken strategy might at one point in that person's life have been the only strategy they knew to survive. And Hemingway touched on this subject. You don't have this slide, it's more picture-based. In Farewell to Arms, said in World War I, quote from that, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places." And again, it's a way of honoring the fact that somebody might have been very damaged earlier in their life, but that actually might become the place where they are strongest, because they've had to do the most work, the most thinking, the most recovery. They've really had to work on themselves in order to become strong again. And so again, it's a way of giving them credit. And also, today is not at all about labeling people. I think you've probably picked up that message from me in several ways already. So we don't call people avoidant or preoccupied. Again, I hope you appreciate that we need to give it its context. The dynamic maturational model, which is this ABC model I've been teaching you, is not based on symptom-based diagnoses, but rather understanding the function. Okay, the distinction there I'm making is if you have people who are diagnosed with, for example, personality disorders, borderline, antisocial, various histrionic, narcissistic, etc., these are symptom-based diagnoses. The model that I'm talking about today is function-based. So it's the difference between focusing on the top part of that triangle, or the function or meaning part of the triangle. And attachment strategies can only properly be assessed using proven instruments. So a little bit of a health warning here. We've only got 10 minutes to go, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about how it will develop A, B, and C strategies. And just a health warning here is that we're going to discuss material that might cause you to reflect on your own strategies and your own life history of attachments, relationships, and emotional coping. But it is not intended to beat yourself up about not being a quote-unquote perfect parent, whatever that is. partner, friend, worker, colleague, sibling, son, or daughter. Okay, so this is not an opportunity to beat ourselves up. And remember, there's great value in attuned repair. And the concept of being good enough is well worth remembering when we consider what follows. Okay, these two concepts here of predictability and attunement are absolutely central to understanding how the attachment strategies get underway. What we're going to do is we're going to just use 3 different variations on predictability and attunement, and that's going to give us our A, our B, and our C strategies. The predictability of the parent's responses, sometimes that's also called being consistent, and the other is attunement. And attunement here means a response from the parent that lessens the baby's distress. So an attuned response to a hungry baby would be to be fed. If the baby's tired, get help to rest. If the baby's bored, give a bit of stimulation. If the baby's in pain, they get comforted. These are all examples of attuned responses because they lessen the baby's distress. So these 3 variations on predictability and attunement will give us our A, B, and C strategies. So here's when it's going well. We see here a little girl, she's playing with her friend. They're engaged in play. She experiences a threat of some type. She runs to her mother in this instance. She receives an attuned and predictable response from her mother. Arm around the shoulder, mirrored facial expression, soothed, validated. Her feelings are validated, and she can return to a secure state, relaxed, warm, and soothed. And then she can go back to explore and learn. So here you see the interrelationship between a secure attachment and our later ability to form relationships, and of course after puberty into adolescence, young adulthood. The similar pattern there would be her ability to go off and form meaningful, intimate relationships with others. Okay, so that's a nice, happy scenario, and it applies not just to us, but to other animal species. John Bowlby often compared attachment strategies not just in humans, but he pretty much saw that these attachment strategies work with pretty much all other mammals. So we have some cute animal pictures coming up. So with each of these, we could consider safety, comfort, proximity, and predictability. Okay, see how these are operating with all of these different mammals that we're looking at here. I think we could probably see safety, comfort, proximity, and predictability in this photo. That one looks particularly posed, doesn't it? A proud mama there. Okay. Again, safety, comfort, proximity, predictability. These attachment strategies play out in lots of different animal species. We might make the mistake of thinking eye gaze is mainly just important to us, but this certainly seems important here. Proximity seems to be a really important one here, and again, these are mammals. Horse lovers will know that for mama to have her tongue out means that she's very relaxed. And again, safety, comfort, proximity, predictability. This was from a documentary about a year or two ago, Animal Odd Couples. These odd interspecies friendships, they seem to arise from 2 situations. One is when they meet in infancy. In other words, they don't see the difference between them. Or, as we might see in an example coming up in a moment, friends for life, best buddies. But here, another scenario is one species, a female with very strong maternal instincts. Maybe she takes on and adopts an orphan from another species. This one looks a bit intimidating. A bit surprising. Yeah. Yeah. And again, sometimes this is called the dance of attunement. There's a kind of a... I don't want to focus too much here on the elephants. I don't want to anthropomorphize too much here. But certainly if we look at the mother and daughter there, this is often called the dance of attunement. It has a certain kind of spontaneity to it, a certain kind of immediate being, both being in the moment, a certain kind of playfulness, a certain delight in each other's minds and what's happening between the two of you? Yeah, the dance of attunement. And you kind of know it when you see it. And it can happen also in quite large families. This is a family with 7 children, 3 of whom are biologically theirs. 4 are adopted from 4 different countries. I think they're doing rather well, this couple. If you just went on the basis of proximity and who gets physical contact, the one child who doesn't get physical contact, what does he get? He gets the eye contact. I think they're doing remarkably well. They also had a lot of support from his parents and her parents. They lived around the corner. This couple had a lot of love to give, and they also have a lot of support. Okay. So, in 5 minutes or less, I'm going to cover how we get to our A, our B, and our C strategies. This is going to be a bit of a thumbnail sketch here, but it'll give you the essential information. By the way, if you wanted a full coverage of this, if you happen to be a member of CC Inform Adults, that website, does that ring a bell? CC Inform Adults? I think they've got a stall here today. My article about this that summarizes this and has some of this imagery on it is going to be posted in about 2 weeks' time on there. So you can go to CC Inform Adults and have coverage of this. Or the book is available in the library. So, the B strategy that I talked about earlier when we were looking at the arrow, how does that get underway? This arises from when the baby or the infant receives predictable and attuned caregiver responses. So this is a baby who learns from the very early weeks of life, when I cry, in a predictable way, I get helped to feel better. If I cry because I'm hungry, I get fed. If I cry because I'm tired, I get helped to rest. If I cry because I'm hot, they take a layer off. If I cry because I'm cold, they put a layer on. Okay, these kinds of ideas. Right? So this baby is going to learn to value equally the only 2 sources of information they have, which is the information from inside their body, namely their feelings, their physical sensations. And of course, babies are profoundly feeling little beings. So you're going to learn that that is a useful source of information. Why? Because if they get in touch with those feelings and they communicate it in the form of a cry, in a predictable way, they will be helped to feel better. Therefore, this information from inside my body is useful. The other information that they're going to give equal value to is the information from outside their body, mainly on the level of contingency. Babies from day 1 are able to learn through the principles of cause and effect. I've done lots and lots of studies on babies being able to learn through behavioral reinforcement. So babies are capable of learning if-then consequences. And we're going to call that, for the sake of our purposes here today, cognition. Cognition in the sense of links of cause and effect through time. If I cry, something happens to make me feel better. That is a cause and effect link, and I can learn that from day 1, and obviously it will be reinforced as the days carry on. So this baby is going to learn to value equally these 2 sources of information, which is why the image here is that of the balanced scales, because they are balancing cognition and affect. Information from outside their body, information from inside their body. The only 2 sources of information they have. They can't do higher cognition yet. They can't do math. They can't do philosophy. They can't do forward planning. They can't do consequential thinking. They can't do perspective taking. All of that will come later as the brain develops. But what they can do is learn. And how they learn is through this basic principle of what is reinforced behavior. So that's going to lead to a baby who balances thoughts and cognition. And if that baby winds up being relatively secure inside, to use another term that's sometimes used in replacement of the B strategy, that won't surprise us, because this is a baby who's learning to balance thoughts and cognition. So we're going to look at a different scenario now, which is the A scenario. This baby receives a different kind of parental response. Here what they receive is predictability, but what's predictable is unattuned. Now this can happen in any family. It can happen at a very mild level or all the way to the child protection level of things. It can happen in any family. What the consistent part of it, though, is that they receive a predictable response, but what's predictable is that it's unattuned. So this baby is learning that every time I cry, I am made to feel worse. So what might be some responses that I get? Well, I might cry, and my very well-meaning and loving parent comes to me, they pick me up, and with the very best of intentions, they agitate me. They do something like this. Calm down, baby, calm down, little sweetie, calm down. In other words, my parent, despite their great love for me, they just haven't got the knack of calming me down. Maybe because they didn't experience it, we don't know. But that's at the mild level, that's not a child protection level thing or anything like that. At the much more extreme level, of course, it would be things like every time I cry, no one comes. Neglect. Every time I cry, I get pinched. Every time I cry, I get shaken. Every time I cry, I get screamed at. Every time I cry, I get punched. Every time I cry, I get a burn. Obviously, that's at the much more extreme child protection end of things. But the consistent thing there is that it's predictable, and what's predictable is lack of attunement. So this can be very mild or it can be very extreme. If every time I cry, I am made to feel worse, what am I going to learn? Not to cry. Yeah, not to cry. So you can see babies as young as 6 to 8 weeks old who have learned to inhibit pretty much all display of tears. As they grow older and on into toddlerhood, they can also develop, neurologically, they'll be capable of generating a false positive. So a bright, happy smile to cover up a whole mountain of pain inside. And these babies will grow increasingly disconnected from their authentic inner experience, which is why the scales are leaning towards cognition and thinking, because they're putting the emphasis on the information from the outside world. Why? Because the outside world is predictable. They know that if I cry, I will be made to feel worse. The information that is dangerous to this baby is the information from inside their body. This information becomes off limits. Why? Because if I get in touch with this information, I might communicate that in the form of a cry, and I will be made to feel worse. Therefore, this information from inside my body, off limits. And we have a continuum here of how that might play out over time. Could lead into really compulsive caregiving behavior or super compliant behavior. Later, after puberty, it can lead on to promiscuity, as the person tries to meet some of their attachment needs but not risking intimacy. Self-reliance and isolation, and more towards the psychiatric end of things, it can lead into the realm of delusional ideas as a desperate attempt to achieve some level of comfort in a world that is predictably dangerous. Okay? So there's a continuum there, and I've given you approximate ages when we develop the capacity to have those different strategies. So another message here is that the A strategy is not just one thing, they can actually have a lot of variations. Finally, I'm just going to do a C strategy, and then we'll be finishing. C strategy is the opposite of the A strategy. Here, the background is that we have unpredictable and variably attuned caregiver responses. So this is when I cry, sometimes my parent comes, sometimes my parent does not. The problem for me is that I can't predict it. So what you have in these scenarios is babies who learn that if they hyperactivate their display of feelings, they gain a certain measure of predictability over an unpredictable caregiver. If I really, really cry, maybe my slightly distractible mother or father, who's dealing with lots of other chaos in the family perhaps, or maybe they're just distractible, or maybe they're going through depression, or maybe they have a mental illness, or maybe there's substance misuse, or maybe there's domestic violence. Whatever it is that makes my parent unpredictable, and by the way, it doesn't have to be at that extreme end. This can happen in any family where you just introduce an unpredictable caregiver response. What the baby is learning is that if they really hyperactivate the display of their genuinely felt feelings, they're going to gain an extra measure of predictability over their attachment figure. So when their attachment figure can't stand the crying anymore, they come into the room. And then after about 8 months of age, when the C strategy really begins to move into its glory, the baby is going to learn, not only do I hyperactivate my display of these feelings, but once I have my attachment figure's attention and they try to solve my problem, what do? I give them a new problem, and a new problem, and another, and another, and another, and another, and I keep my attachment figure hooked into an ongoing, everlasting series of unsolvable struggles. And by doing that, I'm solving, to some degree, my fear of abandonment. That's what is underneath the C strategies. And again, we have a continuum here of what's possible later developmentally. It can have threatening, disarming, it can move on into quite aggressive or feigned helpless behavior later on, punitive or seductive. And the reason why the scales are going in that direction is because this is a person who is learning that their feelings, and getting in touch with their feelings and exaggerating their feelings, particularly feelings of fear, anger, sadness, and needing comfort, are what gets their needs met. And they are discounting cognitive information. So they're going to really be leaving out the information about cause and effect, their role in a sequence of events. Perspective taking won't really mean anything to them. And if I could summarize, because I know we're coming to the end here, I think in terms of take-home messages from this would be, if we're trying to help individuals and we're doing an assessment and we come with some hypotheses about whether they might be using some A strategies or C strategies, part of the implication of this is that they might need very different forms of intervention. Very simply put, this is a great oversimplification, but I think it does have some use. If you were working with somebody who had a lot of A strategy going on, you wouldn't want to do a lot of perspective taking work with them before you help them to get in touch with their own authentic feelings, because that's the bit they leave out. With C strategy, if you really help them to get in touch with their feelings, that might just be doing what they always do. They're kind of spinning their wheels. There, it might be great use to them and benefit to them to bring in the cognitive domain, being able to recount sequences, narratives, time, place, sequence, cause and effect. What was my role in that? How did that affect the other person? That's the bit of information that they might be leaving out. Okay, so we're at time. There's a few slides we didn't have a chance to cover, but it's very important to keep the time today. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think we're going into a break time now. What time should people be back? Right?
Yeah, if people can get back by 10 to, you can. Just like Clark is going to have to leave, so can I just thank you, Clark, for that. It was very informative. Thank you on behalf of nothing.
Okay, thank you very much.